Frankly, I don't know what they're talking about, ready for a confrontation. The confrontation with Russia will not be in the mid-Atlantic. It's not going to be in the mid-Pacific. In other words, it's not going to be a naval war per se. And any of our surface vessels, and for that matter, even our submarines, could be tracked. Now, the nuclear submarines in deep water can't be easily tracked, but the surface vessels can. So the notion that somehow or another he's ready to do something strikes me as ludicrous nonsense.
So in your piece, you talk about the readiness right now. And I like how you start. You say, this time it's different, that somehow they're telling us that it's going to be different. And NATO is not prepared to do this. We're running out of ammunition. Where do you think NATO goes from here? It sounds like, and if you listen to this admiral talking, we need a wartime economy. He says that we need to turn our factories into military production machines right now because our stocks are drying up and we're going to take Russia head on. We need to convert factories in all of these NATO countries and go all out for a full-blown head-on collision with Russia.
Well, it's useful to keep in mind that in Russia, the manufacturing facilities for military equipment and weapons and ammunition are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Russia's already mobilized and integrated 300,000. The possibility that they will bring in more is very, very likely. I don't dispute that, because every time the Russians look to us and indicate a willingness to talk, we make it abundantly clear that the Russians have a choice. They can either completely withdraw from Ukraine or commit suicide. That's not necessarily a good starting point for negotiations. So the Russians are doing what you would expect them to do. They're getting ready for a much larger fight if necessary. This is something we're not prepared for. No one in Europe is prepared for this. We're not prepared to mobilize anybody in Western Europe. The only people who've mobilized soldiers at all to this point are the Poles. And the Poles are courageous people. There's no question about it. I think the notion of going to war with Russia at this stage is idiotic. But they also don't have the most modern equipment and capabilities that we do. So even though they can provide numbers, they're not necessarily capable of augmenting us. And we have at most 50,000 combat troops in Europe. At most, we have 100,000 soldiers in Europe, but that doesn't mean combat soldiers. That just means soldiers. In terms of those people that carry the fight to the enemy, that close with and destroy the enemy, that launch rockets, missiles, and ammunition at the enemy? No, we've only got 50,000. We're now looking at a force in and around Ukraine of what, 700,000 plus, with the potential to go close to 1 million, and new plans to permanently expand the Russian military establishment, especially the army. This is all crazy nonsense. We ought to stop talking about it. We need to get back to understanding the Ukrainians are losing badly. They're taking horrific casualties. They're crumbling down in southern Russia, and the Russians have yet to launch their major offensives. I mean, stop and consider that. They're not even facing the body of the force that's on its way to them at some point, and so they're falling apart.
So the 200,000 then in southern Ukraine, you talk about this 200,000 that Jens Stoltenberg said last night, that Putin is mobilizing this additional 200,000 for this new invasion to topple Ukraine, and he won't stop, warns the NATO chief. He's not going to stop. So this new mobilization...
Well, he's not going to stop until the Ukrainian forces are destroyed.
Right.
That was made very, very clear early on. That's the threat to Russia. And of course, we keep calling this an invasion. In reality, this is a counterstroke. He's responding to the threat that metastasized in eastern Ukraine, designed to destroy Russia. We're talking about defeating Russia, humiliating Russia, dismembering Russia. Good Lord, I'm surprised he hasn't simply declared war at this point and mobilized millions.
Right. Well, you have then, I want to put up this quote by Steve Bannon because I think it's, certainly when we talk about Crimea, right? So this is what we've been hearing from the intelligence chief in Ukraine, as I mentioned at the top, that now the Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Crimea will be retaken by Ukraine. And here's what Steve Bannon said: the globalists with the Biden regime leading have taken the war from defend Ukraine to liberate Crimea after $100 billion and losing a third of the country to the Russian army. So now this is the new message. Liberate Crimea. Forget defend Ukraine. Is that what we're starting to see now? More this talk is that's the new mission.
I'm beginning to think that there was never much coherent strategy to begin with, other than we're here to hurt Russia. I mean, that's essentially what we were told. This whole thing has become incoherent now.
Right.
The notion of striking at and liberating, as they say, liberating Crimea is a bunch of nonsense. It's all crazy. And I'm afraid what the Russians are discovering is the only way to put an end to this nonsense is for them to commit 100% to the destruction of the Ukrainian forces and ultimately to the elimination of this regime in Kyiv. Now, they're going to do that. But instead of seeing this sort of massive blitzkrieg that we're accustomed to because of the experience with the Germans in World War II, I think you're talking about 3 or 4 axes where you have effectively meat grinders on each one. Imagine bulldozers that are just moving forward, steamrolling what they find in their path until ultimately everything is gone. This is going to take a little longer, but the Russians want to be absolutely certain that they've annihilated the enemy. That's what we're going to watch. I also think the Russians are very concerned about our impulsiveness. We're in no position to interfere with what they're doing in Ukraine. And this is the reason I wrote this. Again, people need to be warned. This regime in Washington is amateurish. They're ideological and amateurish. They don't really understand what they're up against. They never did. They miscalculated when they thought, well, the Russians are weak. See, they didn't come in there gangbusters the way we would. Well, of course they didn't, because they were dealing with brother Slavs. They didn't want to kill Orthodox Christian Slavs. They were trying to find a way around it. When it became clear there was no alternative, that's when everything changed. So you're going to see the giant meat grinders show up and crush whatever is left in that country. But the more we talk about lashing out, the more we talk about, quote unquote, liberation or removing Putin or these kinds of things, the worse it's going to get. We got to get out of this business and start coming to terms with reality. But reality is not very popular in Washington.
No, but it seemed like there was a moment of clarity from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in Ramstein, Germany, just last week, when he said, and you pointed this out in your piece, when he said, look, there's a narrow window here for NATO. There's a very narrow window for us to, I guess what he was saying is, funnel as much weapons as we can in order to somehow help with this offensive right now before Putin launches this massive strike.
I think he's talking about trying to rescue Ukraine before it collapses. Right now, a friend of mine who is a demographer got a hold of me and said, look, Doug, at the beginning of this war, there were supposedly 37.4 million people in Ukraine. Says in reality, there were already 2 million Ukrainians working in the United Kingdom and the European Union. And once the war began, over 10 million Ukrainians left. In other words, they packed up their bags and they moved out. 1 million plus went into Russia. The rest went west. Now, if you look at those numbers and then you consider that right now, inside the areas currently controlled by the Russians, there are 4 million so-called Ukrainian citizens. Of course, they're Russians. They speak Russian. They are Russians, and they're living under Russian administration. They're all very happy to have, quote unquote, been liberated. But when you start adding up these numbers and then you look at the casualties that no one wants to tell the truth about, you're looking at 18 to 22 million people left in Ukraine.
Wow.
Now,
wow.
Clayton, that's the size of the Netherlands. The Netherlands. You cannot maintain this war with a million plus under arms and enormous quantities of equipment being poured into it with 22 million people right now, especially when they're all living on the edge of poverty. They have no energy. They're worn out. They're exhausted. And the discontent in Ukraine is absolutely out of the ballpark. People there are sick of it. And they're sick of Zelensky. His soldiers keep posting videos that they take of themselves and their comrades on the front line saying, here we are. We're starving. We're freezing. We're being abandoned. The wounded are being left alive, alone to die. And now we also have this epidemic with tuberculosis that the West refuses to recognize. These are terrible conditions. Ukraine is headed for collapse. So Austin is saying, look, give us all you can right now because this may be our last shot. Now, inside NATO, though everyone is keeping quiet, most of NATO is absolutely enraged that this continues. They want it to stop. They see no point in this. but everyone is afraid to contradict or cross the United States. And I understand that. They want good terms with us. They want good relations with us. They want to trade with us. But increasingly, privately, they're saying this is out of control. We didn't sign up for this. And the Europeans did not sign up for total war with anybody.
Right. Well, and it seems like you've got these countries that are, you know, as my dad used to say, stuck between a hell and a handbasket? No, I can't forget all
rock and a hard place.
Rock and a hard place, hell and a handbasket. All my dad's idioms growing up, it's hard to remember. Some of them are off color, and I can't use the language here on the show. Yeah, but, you know, you see like countries like Poland, countries like Portugal, who are funneling old 1970s Leopard tanks there just to, I guess, appease the West and say, here, President Biden, see, we have these old museum pieces. We want to be in your good graces. And Poland now going to send F-16s, and they just got all these new Apache helicopters that they're buying from the U.S. and going to be sending. So you're right. I think they're just going to keep funneling this there to make the United States happy. Is that the goal?
I think that's true for everybody but Poland. And I think this Polish government lives in the distant past. When you mention Russia, I think they see Bolshevik Russia in the 1920s. They see the Soviet Union, they see Stalin. You know, they refuse to come to terms with the reality that Russia is not a Soviet state. It's not a communist state. The Russians are not interested in a war with Europe. They want desperately to do business with Europe. Moscow does not want to occupy and rule other people that are not Russians.
Right.
I mean, one of the great lessons of imperialism is that imperialism doesn't work very well. Territorial imperialism is expensive. You end up with large numbers of people who are foreign to you. They don't really want to be governed by you. The Russians learned this. And this was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's mission. His famous observation. He said, we Russians should be glad that these people are free and independent of us. We don't want to rule them. We want our own country. And no one is more devoted to Alexander Solzhenitsyn than Putin. So the notion that the Russians want to come in and deal with 40 million unhappy, miserable Poles is absurd.
Right.
It's just not true. But they're pushing this war. And I think in their minds, they believe that if they do this hard enough, that they will endear themselves to us. They haven't figured out something. We don't live in Europe. You know, we're a maritime and an aerospace power. We don't maintain major land forces overseas. That's why you've only got 50,000 combat troops, if that, in Europe right now. So they've lost their minds. And we have had a bad habit of, over the years, overextending ourselves. And when people came to us and said, well, we don't like country X, help us, we should have said many, many times, get along with your neighbors. War is not the only option.
Right.
Find a way forward. Well, so we're in the position of the tail wagging the dog. We're the dog. Everybody's got a hold of our tail and wants to wag the deckings out of it.
Well, it seemed, and I just got from your piece, it really seems like we're at this inflection point right now, this tipping point. You know, if NATO really wants to go all in and do whatever it can to try to quote unquote save what's left of Ukraine, this is going to be a disaster. Either that or they pick it up and they go home, which doesn't seem likely.
Well, Clayton, back in January, I was interviewed in Washington by Dimitri Simes for one of his programs. And I was asked specifically about NATO. And I said, if we push this and the Russians go in and we fail to negotiate an end to this quickly, this will destroy NATO. Remember, NATO was founded as a defensive alliance. Was never designed for offensive operations.
Right.
There's nothing in the NATO charter about attacking anyone. Everything's about being the object of attack, the victim of attack. We have been trying to use NATO as an offensive weapon since the 1990s, since stupid people like Senator Lugar in the Senate said, well, either NATO is out of area, in other words, it's going to operate beyond Europe, or it's out of business. And most of us stood around at the time in the military and said, well, maybe it needs to go out of business because there's no reason for it to exist anymore. So we've reinvigorated in our minds the Russian threat. We've provoked it. We succeeded. It's there. But it would be misleading to assume that there is an aspiration to dominate the continent. It's a losing proposition. The Russians know that. That's not what they're about. They're very disappointed in the Germans, who are their principal trading partners, and can't understand why Germany has turned so radically hostile to Russia. There's no reason for it. Poland, however, is the danger point, because Poland is the one nation that will commit itself all out to war against the Russians, as foolish and misguided as that is. No one else wants that. So I think as this moves forward and we put more and more pressure on the alliance, eventually the alliance will crumble because this is not what Europeans want. All you have to do is look at the polls. 60+% of Europeans everywhere are saying, no, we don't want a war with Russia. You're in Portugal. The Portuguese have said, sure, send them our old stuff. Make them happy. We love the United States. We want good relations with them. I don't see any Portuguese lining up to fight in the east, in eastern Ukraine. Forget it. It's not going to happen.
No way. Unbelievable. So this could lead to the total destruction of NATO. I've
always worried about that.
Yeah,
NATO is a sort of what was the old Henry James used to say, sacred cows are never slain. They simply vanish. Well, over time, I think NATO would simply have vanished because there was no real requirement for it. But now I think there's a good chance it will be slain and go out of business the hard way.
Right. You always need an enemy. So you try to create one, provoke one, and it's going to come back to bite you. So soldiers, disaffected soldiers saying enough is enough, going to Kiev and saying, where's Zelensky? Where's this leadership? We've had enough of it. Now, I want you to clarify that because I've played videos of Ukrainian soldiers pointing out that they are chastising their leadership, talking about how they have no food, they have no weapons. And when we play these clips, we get hundreds of people that say, thank you for sharing the truth about what's happening there. And then inevitably, you get the few that say, this is all fake. This is fake news. You're a Russian puppet for showing what Ukrainian soldiers are saying about their leadership. But this is actually happening, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. Without question. I would compare the situation to the Tsarist army in 1917. I mean, the Russian forces, and they were not all Russians at that point, Ukrainians, Russians, all sorts of people from all over then, the Tsarist Empire, they were dying by the boatload fighting the Germans. And if you go back and look at World War I, the Germans were totally different from the Germans of the Second War. They had no interest in invading the Soviet Union or invading Russia. And so what they did is they set up defenses on the eastern borders of Poland and the Baltic littoral. And then the Tsarist army simply expended its resources, human and otherwise, against German defenses with plentiful artillery and machine guns, mines and wire. And finally, the Tsarist army said, we've lost 1.5 million dead. We can't go on like this anymore. And there was no response. The Tsar should have said enough's enough, ended it, and led his army home. He'd still be in business if he had, but he didn't do that. And so you get the revolution. I think this is where the Ukrainians are headed, unless there's peace. And I think they know that. I think a bunch in Kiev is worried about it. There's no doubt in my mind. And if you go to Kherson, this area that was evacuated, the Ukrainian secret police has set up quite a network there and is running around punishing people left and right for speaking Russian. I mean, imagine sending American police into Arizona or New Mexico and punishing someone who speaks Spanish. It's absurd. Well, this is what's been going on. And very, very deliberately, the Russians have targeted SBU headquarters, Ukrainian secret police headquarters in Kherson, with the goal of essentially killing them and knocking them out of business. This whole house of cards in Ukraine will collapse. It's going to collapse sooner than I think Washington realizes.
And yet Washington, as we said in the intro, continues to funnel weapons. You heard President Biden with a new tranche of weapons, mentioning, of course, these new Bradley fighting vehicles. Now, I am not a steeped military man like yourself, but from what I understand of these vehicles, a lot of them had been mothballed for years. We have about 3,800 of them in the United States. There's about 2,500 or 2,800 of them that had been mothballed. They had been retrofitted for the wars in Iraq, in the desert, so they can shoot their anti-aircraft retrofitted and their infantry, so you can put infantry in them as well. Every time we hear about one of these new vehicles being shipped to Ukraine, it's always, and I read the Twitter comments from people, they're like, hallelujah, this is going to turn the tide of the war. This new vehicle will make a change. What do you say about this new tranche of weapons?
Many armies have been through the experience of betting heavily on the arrival of something new to turn things around. It never happens, because warfare is a product of a multitude of factors and various sets of equipment and various kinds of formations. The Bradley right now, the ones that we're likely sending are not necessarily the most up-to-date and modern model by any stretch of the imagination. And the Bradley, while it was adequate in 1991 for the war that we fought, is not a particularly impressive vehicle. The original Bradleys had the fuel in the essentially underneath the feet of the soldiers riding in the Bradley, and the Bradley was essentially a combination of iron, steel, and aluminum, and they had a bad habit of catching fire. We lost a Bradley in my unit in 1991 because a tow missile that was in the hammer, you had this thing that rises up and then fires the tow missile from the side of the track. That's your anti-tank weapon, if you will. And that exploded because it was struck by a 30 millimeter round from a BMP. The blast went into the Bradley, and the tow missiles that were inside the Bradley then exploded. We had a man killed outright, and then 3 others who were wounded. There were only 4 people at the time on the track, fortunately. We were able to get the other 3 out. They were wounded, obviously, but eventually returned to duty. And the thing burnt furiously for hours. The next morning, it looked like a 113. The turret had literally sunken down into the body of the Bradley. Now, the newest variants that they've been producing are designed differently. They've moved the fuel out of the way. They've changed some of the alloys that are being used. But the point is, this is not a wonder weapon, and it's not easily maintained. You're talking about a 25 millimeter chain gun, which was originally designed for use on helicopters. We had to send people to school for years to master these things. They come back, and in turn, they train soldiers. And it's not something that you do quickly. And I don't know how much experience any of these Ukrainian soldiers will have had with this kind of machinery. I doubt very much. And we haven't even talked about how do you maintain these things, because everything breaks down. It doesn't matter how good it is. And then how do you repair it and get it back into service? So the bottom line is, and I don't expect very many of these Bradleys to show up. Whenever they show up, they're not going to be immediately useful. And this is the problem with everything on that list. Everything we want to send or push into them demands time. Time to train people to use it properly, time to maintain it, time to refit it and send it into action and then keep it running. This is not an easy proposition for the Ukrainians. It would have been much easier if all of this material had been sent in March and April, because then you would have had some time to work on it. At that point, of course, the Russians were not at war with Ukraine. They were engaged in what they thought would be a punitive action to induce negotiations. It took them 3 or 4 months to figure out that wasn't going to happen. Now they are at war with Ukraine. Everything's changed. So the time, the opportunity to make any of this material work in any reasonable or meaningful way is over.
Stark. And we have the United States now, according to a report, and I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel, which is that the United States is now going to be training Ukrainians in Oklahoma on, I think if I'm not mistaken, the Patriot missile system, which we've talked about before here on the show, is largely doesn't even really work. And so we're now bringing Ukrainians into the United States to be trained on these systems and then head back to the battlefield. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't sign on for the notion that it doesn't work.
Okay.
I think it does work. How well is another question that I can't evaluate. But Raytheon produces excellent material, excellent missiles, first-class systems, radars, and so forth. So I wouldn't short shrift Raytheon.
So let me be clear then. What I've been hearing is that you need a lot of them for them to be really effective.
Oh, yeah.
So you need to blanket an area in the
Yeah, when we talked the last time, I said you'd need 10 battalions.
Right.
Okay, so 10 times what, 240 launchers? 10 times 24 launchers in every battalion. That's 240 launchers. That's thousands and thousands of missiles plus radars. And this is something that's very fragile. You can't move it quickly. Now, to go back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the Ukrainians that are going over there are going to get at least 3 months of very serious in-school training. That's fine. That's not enough. You need several months of experience, hands-on experience in the field within organizations of trained people that include officers and non-commissioned officers know what they are doing. My view is this: the probability of the Ukrainians being ready to employ this stuff on their own is very low. I think what we'll try to do is man it largely with Ukrainians, but then put NATO officers and NCOs from the United States, Germany, Great Britain, who have these same launchers, into Western Ukraine. They will then be used for point defense of whatever they deem to be important. They cannot protect the whole area, but they can provide adequate point defense, bridge, airports, factories, command centers, so forth. But when will this happen? Not quickly. Again, all of this takes time. What's coming next are these Russian offensives. And I think with the recent changes in the Russian command structure, moving Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian general staff, in to be the overall commander in Ukraine to ensure that Surovikin, who is still running the daily show, has everything that he wants and everything he needs, suggests to me that when they come, they're going to come soon within the next 3 or 4 weeks, because the ground is now largely frozen. It's going to be a crushing blow. And the Ukrainians themselves had admitted in this last interview, Zaluzhny and even Zelensky admitted what's coming is something we're going to have a lot of trouble surviving. They did everything but say, look, we're going to be crushed. And then they said, you've got to give us all this stuff. The problem with giving everything is too late. It's not going to change anything. But here's the good news inside Washington. The wealth transfer continues. In other words, the money that is moved over to DOD and then into the defense industrial complex and then to donors and interested parties that buy up politicians on the Hill, all of that continues without interruption. That's very important for Washington.
So the machine continues. And all of this talk about pulling back on Ukraine aid, it doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem likely the money's going to continue to flow. And we're going to continue to even build busts and statues inside of Washington, which is the next move. Colonel, thank you so much.
You have one more problem that needs to be addressed, and that is, how could we have miscalculated so badly? People at the top of the U.S. military establishment want nothing to do with this war in Ukraine. They have no objections to sending equipment and advisors, but they made it very clear they do not want this administration to commit any of our forces in Poland or Romania, let alone Polish and Romanian forces, to Western Ukraine. They're opposed to that. They understand that's something we can't do. We can't sustain it. We have 457,000 troops in the so-called active army. That's down from its real strength of 495. We can't recruit. We have only 74,000 men in the so-called ready reserves. So you're not talking about a large pool of replacements. And if we were to go into that environment and fight, you're talking about thousands of casualties, thousands of dead potentially. So the Pentagon knows that. The problem now is they bet heavily that the Ukrainians, based on that initial performance by the Russians, which they completely misinterpreted and didn't understand, they said, see, the Russians are weak. We can win this. That was always wrong. Now the problem is that we're going to have all these forces sitting there. Ukraine is going to collapse under the weight of the Russian offensives. And then people in Washington are going to say, we have to do something. We can't let this happen. We will have been shown as wrong. We will look like fools. We have to, quote unquote, do something. That's a very dangerous statement. And that's one that we've heard before over the last 50 years many times. We have to do something. Well, doing anything at this point in time would be very dangerous and very ill-advised. That's why I continue to warn that at the insistence of people in the White House, the State Department, and potentially on the Hill, the Department of Defense may be goaded into action that it would otherwise not want to take. And in every dispute since 1963 between the JCS and the president and his friends have always won the fight.